Hello, everyone. Welcome to this online event on how is philanthropy changing in the COVID era, co-hosted by Social Innovation Japan and Social Venture Partners. My name is Robin Lewis, and I'm the co-founder of Social Innovation Japan. Thank you so much for joining us on what is a bit of a rainy day here in Tokyo, or if you're joining from the States, good Friday evening to you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm genuinely excited today to be here with all of you to discuss what is a really important and timely theme, which is the role of philanthropy in this current global health crisis. I'm very happy to be joined here today with two industry leaders, Suda Nandagappa, from the CEO of Social Venture Partners, and Kenji Hosokawa, who's a partner at SVP Tokyo. I'm also joined here today by my fellow co-founder of Social Innovation Japan, Keiko Ono as well. So thank you again to all of you for joining. Before we begin, I do have some important housekeeping notes to share with everyone. So please make sure that you are on mute unless you are speaking or asking a question. Let's try to avoid any of these Zoom incidents that we hear about on the internet. So make sure that you are on Zoom when you're not speaking. This session is being recorded, so please just keep that in mind. And we would also really love for this to be an interactive session. So feel free to ask any questions or make any comments in the Zoom chat here. We'll also have plenty of time in the second half of the event for question answers and discussions. I'm sure many of you have your own stories and your own opinions about philanthropy and social impact and so on. So we'd love to hear from you in the second half of the event too. Okay. Before we get into the main content of today, I'd like to do a very quick exercise to just get a temperature check. It's often quite difficult to sense how everyone's doing on Zoom, but I would like you to just take 10 or 15 seconds and let us know how are you feeling today. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is, oh, just terrible. And 10 is, wow, life is amazing. So please write down just one number in the Zoom comments section to let us know how you are doing today. Let's see what we have here. Wow, very high average scores. We usually get someone being like 8.7521, but not today, which is a nice surprise. Wow, so a lot of 10s. This is good. 12 by Social Japan. Very cool. Well, hopefully, I see. Okay, one person cannot hear. Can everyone else hear? Is the audio okay? Okay. Christian, maybe if you're having troubles, maybe try rebooting Zoom, or just message us if you can't hear. Okay. So I'm glad that everyone's feeling good today. Hopefully, for those of you who are not a 10, we will get up there. We'll be at a 10 by the end of this session. So that's the goal of today. Myself, Suda, and Kenji, we had a preparatory call a couple of days ago, and we covered a lot of ground. I feel like we could probably talk for about 3 or 4 hours, but just given that we have a tight time schedule, I would love for us to get straight into it by handing over to our keynote speaker for today, who is Suda, the Chief Executive Officer of Social Venture Partners International. Now, Suda has a very impressive and very broad experience in the field of social impact and philanthropy. She's a strategist, a movement builder. She's focused on democratizing systems of power, and she has a lot of knowledge and insights into how to create systems change. So I will hand over now to Suda to kind of share her insights, her experiences, and give us some ideas of how philanthropy is changing in this new world that we're facing, and what are the opportunities that lie ahead. So Suda, over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for having me virtually today. I wish I was in person in Japan, because Actually, that was the plan for this time of the year. I was supposed to be traveling and hanging out in person with Kenji and others. So hopefully 2021. But I am going to attempt to share my screen before I get started here and hopefully share the right part of my screen. So give me 1 second. All right. Can you all see the slides? We good? Okay, awesome.
Perfect.
I love when Zoom actually works the way I hope it will. So, well, good morning to all of you. It's evening here in Seattle, and it's been a beautiful day. So if you hear dogs barking as I share with you a little bit about philanthropy, it's because everyone seems to be out walking their dogs in the park right now. So I'm here in Seattle, and I've been with Social Venture Partners International now since February 2019. And just to give you all a tiny bit of context about Social Venture Partners International, we are a global network. We've been around for about 20 years. We have affiliates in 8 different countries. We have 43 affiliates, and we have 3,500 committed partners, social change makers, philanthropists and donors all working together to make their communities stronger and to improve the lives of people around the globe. So before we jump into the conversation that Robin so thoughtfully set up, I would love to just hear from each of you in the chat. If you can just drop in, what's one thing that brings you to this conversation today? And we'd love to just see that start going. And I'm going to pick up on that as you all drop those ideas in. And so, philanthropy in 2020 is a little bit of an interesting conversation to have because we went through a huge change. So I'm going to try and frame up for you a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of trends and themes, both historically and where we're at in this moment, but also share some of my thoughts around where we need to go. So first off, the world, we all know this, right? We're in a really challenging position right now. Each of you are here, I think, because like me, you're concerned about the state of the world. You believe in making the world a better place. And I really think that, what we're facing right now are some of the greatest challenges of our time. Of course, the COVID pandemic exacerbates that. But, many of these things were true even before the pandemic began. For instance, we see huge degrees of polarization, isolation, nationalized viewpoints, right? This is happening around the globe. This is not just in the US, although certainly for those of you who've been paying attention to the US in the last several decades, we've seen a huge increase in nationalized viewpoints here in this country. And one of the things, that comes alongside that is that we're also seeing increasing concentrations of wealth and power around the world. So to give some context to that, Amazon earnings last quarter were up 40% with net profits of $5 billion. And these numbers are actually from the summertime. I would imagine that just after Black Tuesday, those numbers are probably even higher. And that's all happening in the context of, I don't know about all of you and where you're situated, but certainly on a daily basis, I'm hearing from my friends who run small businesses here in Seattle, restaurants are closing, our local business infrastructure is basically completely shutting down. And that, throughout the US, we're seeing this in the nonprofit sector as well. And around the globe, we're seeing this in the social change sector. Organizations are struggling to figure out how to respond to this moment, how to actually maintain resources in light of the crisis, and to continue to do, all the work that needs to be done, in fact, at a greater degree than ever before. And at the same time, we're also seeing, as I talk to all of you in Japan, Japan's no stranger to the challenges of climate change and of economic and environmental challenges. And those issues, of course, are happening here in the US. here in Seattle, my personal experience this summer, we couldn't go outside for 2 weeks because of the smoke from fires related to climate change. And Australia experienced huge climate change related fires earlier in the year. And all of this is, it's, when taken in total, is a pretty devastating story. And what I looked at, this year as COVID began, is really looking at the fact that COVID is bringing to light disparities that up until this point have existed, but have largely just been undercover a little bit, right? So it's magnifying disparities, it's magnifying the way in which our economic system is an extractive economy, no matter where you are in the globe. And that despite being a globalized economy, there are large populations, communities, and countries just who are left behind and left out right now. And, what we're dealing with right now in the US is that certainly, I think, reflected on a global scale, right? That COVID-19 is rapidly expanding an economic divide that was already a huge problem. And we're seeing that around the globe as well. Taking a puppy pause because I just shared a lot of dire news. And I always think puppies make everything better. So with that in mind, so I've just said all these things, but puppies still exist. So the world has possibility is how I think about it, including, philanthropy, right? So we exist and our role is supposed to help address these issues. And actually, philanthropy really has been doing that for a long time. In fact, philanthropy has been the solution for a long time, but in recent years, what we're seeing is that, especially in the US and in certain parts of the globe where there isn't a strong social sector, philanthropy has begun to be people have looked to philanthropy to fill the role of what in many places government has historically done. So it raises a major question, right? Should philanthropy's role be to address, making sure that someone has food and a roof over their head, or is philanthropy's role about innovation and social change and driving forward things that government otherwise wouldn't be able to do? So these are big questions ahead for philanthropy. And a lot of this, and certainly with the rise of large philanthropic institutions, is in the context of questions about, where is the money going? And it's not as much a question about how much money we have for philanthropy. Time and time again, what we're seeing is, not enough resources, for instance, getting to the global South, who have borne the brunt of an extractive system around the globe for many, many years. We in the US see this replicated as well with, most funding does not reach our communities of color, does not reach women of color-led organizations. And these numbers aren't just true on the nonprofit scale, they also are reflected in social impact investing, in starting up of businesses, in access to loans, and other ways in which people are trying to get access to the economy. And alongside that is this issue that, the most promising ideas, the new initiatives, the opportunities that people are looking to kind of bring forward new thinking, especially as our world changes so rapidly, often those are the ones that struggle the most to get resources. And a lot of this has to just do with the networks that do exist, right? Many of the big foundations continue to grant to the same organizations that they've had in their portfolio for years. People who have wealth tend to be networked with people who have wealth. And so the money tends to stay in a circular way and not get outside of that system. So really, it all comes down to, when we think about it, problems are changing, the world is changing, and philanthropy needs to change alongside that. And we don't really have the playbook for how to do that. What we do know, and I'll just say for social venture partners, what's exciting is that, we were ahead of the sector in adopting core practices. We have 2 decades of global experience sort of asking the question of how can we do things differently? How can we break up those networks of power that exist and actually make sure that power is shared? And really thinking about, these sort of really strong practices of getting out there into community, working in partnership, being part of our communities, being close to the issues, being problem solvers alongside those who have experienced the challenges, so that we're not out here to be saviors. We're out here to say, this is something that's about making our communities stronger together. So we have been doing this work as a community in lots of different ways, and Kenji will share more about how SVP Tokyo approaches this work. But what's become really clear is that even this may not be enough, that it is time for us too to ask the question, how can committed individuals really upscale what we're all doing right now so that we can have greater impact in the world and accelerate change? So let me tell you about some really promising and exciting emerging trends. So I pulled some of the reports from Giving Tuesday, which just happened on this previous Tuesday. It's a global day of giving. And they reported that in 2019, their numbers were $1.7 billion raised on Giving Tuesday. In 2020, they raised, or sort of the collective giving that day was $2.47 billion. And that's just the United States numbers. They haven't pulled their global numbers yet. So that's a 25% increase compared to Giving Tuesday 2019. What we're also seeing in terms of emerging trends is huge increase in digital giving. And 2/3 of online gifts come from women. Again, these are North American numbers, and one of the challenges in philanthropy is actually getting global numbers and global data. But what we're also seeing even earlier this year is that giving in the US alone surpassed the level of giving that we saw post 9/11. But there's also been a huge shift around the globe in terms of the kind of giving. So it's online giving. We're seeing, certainly in the US, there was a huge increase in political giving because of the political nature of this year. Giving towards systemic change has really shifted. So people are concerned about systems. They're giving more to advocacy efforts. They're giving more to changing our economic systems. The concerns around racial justice that started this, the kind of reckoning around racial justice that started this summer, that too has spread around the globe. We're hearing from colleagues in South America, in Australia, in Europe about how much the conversation about Black Lives Matter in the US has actually opened up a conversation about racial justice and the racialized nature of our economic system, no matter where you are in the globe. And we're also seeing people do a lot more just mutual aid. So things like buying, going to your local restaurant and making sure that on a weekly basis, people have made commitments to local restaurants, that people are trying to shop local to maintain their local businesses. So there is a really strong culture of giving that is emerging in this moment, that those of us who pay attention to this kind of philanthropy are very inspired by, and certainly feel like that is a very promising sign in this moment. At the same time, we're also seeing this sort of question of, okay, that's important, but it doesn't come without concerns, right? So one of the questions that we're watching for and concerns that we're thinking about is, what are the inequities that might be replicated in this moment, right? So if I'm giving because I kind of see a few set of issues and the things that are most present in front of me, what might I be missing? When we rely on individuals by themselves to see the whole ecosystem, we know that there are going to be hidden inequities that aren't captured. At the same time, we also have to think about what are some of the historic problematic dynamics that could be replicated in this moment. One thing we've seen, a lot of folks are comparing this to giving after disasters, and where you see that peak in giving right after a disaster moment, but then as communities need to shift, as they need to really focus on rebuilding and resilience, the giving drops. So it's really critical that we keep this level of engagement, not just now, but really for the long term, and that people are committed to going in with communities that we're all in this together, and really thinking about philanthropy as one of a suite of tools to make sure that our communities are stronger. And then finally, really this question that a lot of donors are asking, they're saying, yes, I'm willing to write a check, but what else can I do? And that is really a question, whether I'm sitting here in the US or sitting in India, asking, I want to help my community. I'm not just here because I want to write a check. I know that that's one thing I can do, but certainly we are seeing a lot of people saying, hey, I want to start thinking about our economic system. I want to start thinking about other ways that I can change and influence. If I work for a corporation that's multinational, I want to be connecting with my colleagues to figure out how are we getting our corporation to take a different stance, to be a business that is really making our communities stronger. So just in wrapping up, a few things that I just want to pose, and then I'll hand it off back to Robin. So really, I think of this moment as asking ourselves the question, what's possible now that wasn't possible before? And in that, to ask, what can we do that will allow us now to reimagine how we share power and wealth, how we think about who sets the agenda, and what action and solidarity really means in a time like this and into the future as we rebuild our communities. And also, finally, what does our economic model need to look like? We know that this, as it currently exists, is probably not the model that will make our communities strongest for the future. So what are the innovations and the updates that we can begin to see around the globe to make sure that we have strong communities and that we are resilient for the major challenges of our time, whether they are, pandemics like the one we're experiencing right now, or the prolonged challenges of things like the racial justice situation, or the climate change challenges that we're seeing around the globe. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Robin, and we'll continue the dialogue in our panel. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Sid. I think in that 20 minutes, you just summed up, I think, philanthropy in 2020, both the challenges, but also the trends. I mean, you mentioned some quite staggering statistics. You mentioned that from $1.7 billion raised on Giving Tuesday last year, it's now gone up to $2.47 billion. And that's quite a remarkable increase. You've also pointed out that online and digital giving is rising rapidly, along with many other industries. So it's not just the tech and all these other industries, it's also philanthropy is clearly digitizing. And you've also asked some great questions like what should our economic model look like? What is possible now that wasn't possible before, and so on. So I think this really lays a very strong foundation for our conversation going forward. So thank you, Sudha. Now, before we get into the discussion and the Q&A, and as I mentioned before, we'd love to hear from everyone here as well. I'm going to hand over now to Kenji Hosokawa, who is a partner at SVP Tokyo. He's a veteran in the social impact world. He's done a lawyer by training, and he's done lots of things in the legal space, but also advising many social entrepreneurs and on the board of many organizations as well. So I'm going to hand over to Kenji, who will give a brief overview as to SVP Tokyo.
Yeah, thank you. Can people see this?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so I just wanted to spend a couple of few minutes because I think that the discussion's more interesting. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for that. But a couple of slides to just show what SVP Tokyo is. And this is a quick, like a translation version of a couple of slides that we typically use in Japan when we explain what we do. So it's an organization that currently has about maybe 120 what we call partners. I'm one of those partners. We're all doing this on a pro bono basis. And the idea is that, in my case, I'm a lawyer. There are others who are consultants, accountants, people who are in finance, business owners, who are interested in helping out nonprofits and social entrepreneurs, but not necessarily by just simply giving money, but we're interested in contributing our skills and expertise. And so what this chart shows is that, on one hand, these are the organizations that we support. At any given year, we probably have maybe up to 8 organizations that we're helping. With each of them, we enter typically into a 2-year collaboration, period, where we, the partners give, some, financial assistance, grant in the form of a monetary grant, but mostly, our value add is our expertise. And on average, maybe like 50 to 100 pro bono hours, per partner, and then the idea is that when you combine the the skill sets of the partners with the strong efforts of the social ventures and the entrepreneurs, the result is some social impact that hopefully makes the world a better place. And in terms of specifically what we do, this is like a standard list of things that I think we have supported different organizations with in the past, from things like some organizations require more discrete types of assistance. Could be in terms of fundraising, how to be better at marketing, publicity, internally, they may need more help with accounting, organizational design, personnel. But then, there are organizations that occasionally come to us, and these are frankly quite, a lot more challenging. They want help with, refining or revamping their mission statement, vision, their value propositions, strategy, business development, things like that. So, each organization, for each organization, there are typically about 5 to maybe like 10 individual partners who volunteer to commit certain amount of effort into assisting that organization. And quite often, what ends up happening is that I think the partners who are most interested in the particular cause that's being pursued by that organization, those are the ones who are naturally drawn to that organization to help. So yeah, so those are the 2 quick slides, to put this in a little bit better context. So we're Sudha mentioned that there are 43 affiliates right now in the SVPI network. We're one of them. We've been around for about 15 years, I believe, and this model is what we call venture philanthropy. And this, I think, has been traditionally the model that a lot of the affiliates in SVPI have pursued to help out different nonprofits across the globe. But as she's mentioned in presentation, the world has been changing, and I think that the idea of what makes sense in terms of philanthropy has been dramatically changing. And so you'll see that if you get to know us, SVP Tokyo, this is one model that we continue to think is quite valuable in Japan. But there are other affiliates that are now shifted away from this, and they're doing something completely different and quite innovative. More in terms of, say, like community impact, or more focused on leadership training for entrepreneurs. I hope that gives a little bit of a sense of what we do at SVP Tokyo and puts us in a context of SVP International. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kenji, for that overview. And we'll share some more info on SVP Tokyo later on during the second half of the session. Now, I think I'd like to go into the discussion and Q&A part of the event now. I think we have a very unique opportunity in that we have Sudha, we have Kenji. They bring both international perspectives, but also a Japanese perspective. And we're having this discussion in English. And this is quite a unique thing to have, especially on a Saturday morning. Of course, I recognize that many of you are also very active in the philanthropic space and social impact space and so on. So again, we'll open up the floor later on. But for the first part, I would like to just start with a few questions. I have about 1,000 questions that I would like to ask both Sudha and Kenji, but I will restrain myself. You both mentioned some of the things that you're doing and also that are happening in the philanthropy space in your respective context. But do you see any blind spots as such that the philanthropic community is missing in Japan or the US? For that, I'm going to hand over to Sudha first. So do you see any blind spots that we could be addressing?
Well, I mean, I think I tried to hit on a few of those blind spots, I think, in the original presentation, right? I think writ large, one of the major blind spots for philanthropy is this question of who has power, and who's setting the agenda, right? So if people who have historically benefited from the system and done well are the ones who are setting the agenda and designing the system, both for philanthropy and then also influencing lots of other things happening, I think that's a huge blind spot, right? We just miss when certain people aren't in the room, when communities who are most impacted aren't in the room, we're just missing something. Even, to the point of here in the US, communities of color, most communities of color do not have access to those rooms at the big foundations, right? And so the ability to see solutions, you can't see what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? And that's very true, I think, in the field of philanthropy. And it's very easy to kind of become isolated from what's real and what's on the ground. Kenji?
Yeah, I think in Japan too, we have this, very, similar, a similar blind spot. There's this, I think, kind of a national, ideology in Japan that, we're this, massive, middle class. Everyone's highly educated, and we have a great healthcare system. There are, no, inequities. And I think sometimes it's very hard to kind of cut through that to try to get to the underlying I think structural inequities that actually exist here. So for example, I mean as Sudha mentioned, Black Lives Matter movement has gone global, and there's some I think marches that happened in Tokyo. I'm sure some of you attended, Kyoto, all over Japan, right? But there's still, people in Japan who say that, racism doesn't exist in Japan, right? So I think, sometimes it's the, I mean, I think that the conversation is becoming intense at a place like the U.S. because I think, in the case of the U.S., it's just impossible to try to, think about a way to address a social issue without, acknowledging that, race is a key issue, and I think in Japan, I feel like we're at a stage where we need to go a little deeper in that. I think that these structural inequities are different, depending on where you are, because historical legacies and historical injustices are different. So in the case of Japan, but the conversation just needs to happen more in Japan.
Yeah, and I'll add one other thought too. As you were speaking, Kenji, I was thinking about, the other thing is the philosophy of philanthropy that has some built-in blind spots, which is that, if I do really, really well, then I can, take a pause and either make a foundation or give away my money, right? And I get to choose and kind of follow my passions with how I give away my money. And I think for that, one of the blind spots of that is, of course, one, it comes inherent in it, this sort of savior complex, which in and of itself can be really problematic, with people kind of parachuting in and out of communities as a result. But it also comes with this inherent sense of, I believe, a very Americanized individual exceptionalism attitude, which I think is very different from what you see in a lot of other, a lot of communities. I spent a good portion of my childhood going back and forth to India, very different ethos in India, right? And so one of the blind spots, I think, as philanthropy grows and is a global practice, is making sure that we're not exporting the wrong part of our cultural practices, and sort of thinking that we can address collective systemic problems with individual action, I think gets us into trouble. So I'll let Robin have the floor back before I get on another soapbox.
No, this is I think this is a whole topic unto itself that we could speak about for 3 hours. And I think what is often missing, at least for me in this, in philanthropy in Japan, is this piece about institutionalized discrimination and racism and so on. I think, Sudha, you mentioned that people of color, for example, are less likely to gain access to capital, to grants, to funding. And that, again, leads to this whole spiral of challenges at a systemic level. So these kinds of things are so important. And also, you mentioned, Sudha, that the people who have wealth are connected to people with wealth, right? This is a very kind of closed circle of people who are having these conversations and so on. So I think this is important, not just in the US, but also in Japan too. I think in part of addressing these systemic challenges, you mentioned the role of business, right? Companies are saying, I don't want to just give you a check. I want to strategically support what's going on. I want to get involved at a higher level. Do you see examples of that in both the US and Japan? Can you give us some examples of how people are going beyond that just financial giving? I guess SVP is an exact example of that, but any other interesting examples?
Kenji, do you want to share any examples in Japan that
you're seeing? Sure. I think that the if you go back, maybe 10 years ago, corporate giving or corporate CSR in Japan, people looked at that very cynically, just mostly for PR. But increasingly, it started with the non-Japanese companies that tried to incorporate what was happening outside Japan, and then even Japanese companies are transforming. That they're trying to they now have very active CSR programs and grant giving programs that are not just simply about looking good, but they really care about what kind of community impact they're having, and then also are starting to realize that it's really good for employee development and morale, and so there are a lot of interesting innovations. I mean, I think the one concrete example, Rakuten, everyone knows here it's like an equivalent of Amazon. In Japan, they have a internal accelerator, social accelerator program, which is, we worked with them to, set that up. It's a, SVP Tokyo type a program that Rakuten does internally, and I believe that they're now trying to roll that out in India. I think they're working with our, SVP India to, with some of the people there to make that happen there too. So that's one example that I can immediately think of about how companies are changing. Even Japanese companies are changing.
Thanks, Kenji. Sudha, anything from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add at a high level. I think the rise of B Corps is definitely something that's a trend to watch. I think the other piece that's really fascinating is, there's a lot of research about sort of the demographic of our current workforce, right? As boomers retire, and the demographic around the world of the workforce are folks who want to be engaged in their companies in a different way, right? So there is this internal pressure within companies that employees want companies that are values oriented, and that they want the companies to actually stand for those values, which is why I think we saw this sort of outpouring of Black Lives Matter statements from companies this summer. Now, of course, how do you make that real is a whole other question. But certainly I think that there's this pressure from within a lot of the businesses that's really relevant and important to watch. And I think when I think about the role of business, I do think, I started my career working on corporate accountability and corporate responsibility issues. And you look and you see like so many corporations now are larger than small governments, right? So the level of impact and influence that they can have if a corporation shifts is so dramatic that we would be remiss in the social change movement if we didn't put corporations on notice and include them as part of the strategy, both to do more with their own efforts, but also for them to hold policies and practices that make our communities stronger, right? So, I look at things like the question for Amazon is, are they taking care of their workers? What are they doing for the environment, right? If Amazon makes changes, those are huge for our global community. Same thing when we look at questions of, all of our tech products and where they are being made and how they're being made. So, when I think the role of business is a complicated one, obviously, and one that, for me, I think a lot about business is not just about the brand, it's also about the collection of employees who make up that business. And so how are employees really being enabled to step up and to step out and to sort of have that additional piece of being part of their communities and making their communities better. So not just the sort of one-on-one skill set, but lending the power of the business, lending the power of the collection of employees to different social causes.
That's a really interesting perspective. I think if I can just share my thoughts for what it's worth, I think in the context of Japan, 1995, the Kobe earthquake is often cited as the birth of volunteerism, right? Whether that's right or wrong is a different question, but lots of people flocked to Kobe to help out after the major earthquake. And then we saw more and more engagement in the nonprofit sector and this space. And then in 2011, the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear disaster, of course, created a ginormous impact on society. And that incident, the 2011 tsunami, is often called the birth of corporate volunteerism. So we're seeing like individual volunteerism caused by a major disaster, corporate volunteerism caused by another major disaster. And then the question that I have just generally is will the COVID-19 pandemic create the next stage in this philanthropic development? Will it be more not just giving, like philanthropic giving, but will it be more creating shared value models? Will it be more strategic investments into things that create value for all stakeholders in the supply chain and so on? So it's interesting how these incidents always lead to some kind of transformation in the philanthropic sector.
Yeah. And I'll just say, I think what's interesting, though, is some of the innovations that we're seeing happen on the business side right now, I think are possibly ones of concern, right? I think in terms of the ability for some of these businesses to make the case like, oh, well, we don't have to pay attention to certain environmental practices, or we don't have to pay attention right now because we're in a major disaster moment. So I think it's actually a call for us also to be vigilant about what is happening in the world and what, again, like this is the opportunity for those of us who are connected to businesses. I'm a consumer. All of us are consumers to some degree, right? How do we also demand something different?
Right. So it's great that companies are, for example, standing with the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, but it's about keeping that critical hat on and making sure that businesses really are delivering on their promises in that respect. On that note, I'm going to shift to, we have a question from Lauren in the chat. Lauren's asking, how can we shift the giving from individual responsibility to corporate responsibility more? And how does corporate giving compare with individual giving? And what does capacity building look like for our underserved philanthropists and social ventures, i.e. women and minorities? So I think that's a great question. I mean, I think we've covered some of those bases, but perhaps would one of you like to take this on?
I can kick it off a little bit. Kenji, you might have I'm sure you have things to add. I don't actually know the numbers about corporate giving versus individual giving. What I can say, at least in the US, is that 80% of the nonprofit sector is funded by individuals. So certainly in the US, we are individual donor driven, individuals and families. And then when this question of capacity building look like for underserved communities, I think this is such a good question. And it's one that I have really it's part of what brings me to SVP, is to update what we talk about as capacity building, because there has been a historic notion of the haves and the have-nots, and that to capacity build, it means that I have to I come in and I'll teach you how to write a communications plan. And what we actually see is that in many cases, especially for women and people of color, people from the global South, they have really promising and innovative ideas. And what they need more than anything is someone who can come in and be their kind of teammate to unlock resources, unlock barriers. And that's one of the most critical roles that someone can play, right? To go back to that piece about who has wealth and who's connected to each other, right? If you can get one or two people who unlock that network of power and they share and shift power, it can make dramatic changes. So it's really going from this sort of historic notion of capacity building as I'm going to come in and give you some expertise and empower you, to we have power on both sides, and it's a question of connections, and it's a question of networks, and it's a question of sharing expertise.
Thanks so much, Sudha. I see Lauren's here. I mean, does that answer the question? Do you have any comments or any thoughts that you'd like to share, Lauren?
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for answering the question, Sudha. I mean, yes, I mean, there's so much going on in my head about this. I think that there are a lot of people out there who want to see change happen. There are a lot of causes. So my questions are more directed at, I'm sort of shocked to hear that it's 80-20 in the United States for individual versus corporate. I feel like we aren't pushing the conversation in the direction of, I mean, if we're going to talk about an equitable distribution of wealth or wealth being concentrated in certain areas, I was reading just this morning a post by Paul Graham, who was one of the founders of Y Combinator. Maybe some of you know Y Combinator, which is venture startups. A lot of successful businesses have come out of that. And I think that the notion that creation of wealth, entrepreneurship, and new enterprises, and this should go for us as well, social ventures as well. If we are creating value, then it's not a zero-sum game where we're competing for resources that are limited, but we are creating value through the social change that we're doing. And then I think it's how do we get corporates more involved in that mission? That's why I asked that question, because I think that that is where one of the key blocks exist. So I'm going to stop there because, of course, this isn't in my head completely organized. But thank you both for addressing the questions that I had. Thanks.
Thanks so much for sharing, Lauren. I really appreciate it. And I feel like we can have a very long and an important discussion on this as well. So perhaps we can make this an entire theme onto itself for the next online event. But Kenji, instead of, would you like to respond to that? We can move on to the next question.
Well, can I just point out, there's like, especially in Japan, I think a lot of people, and probably some of you too, feel like, these Japanese companies are just so bureaucratic, can't get anything, can't propose anything. You're always going to get shut down by some bucho or whatever, right? But, I do think, and I've seen actually some of the SVP partners have been like intrapreneurs, meaning like, they made some significant changes within organizations, and that there's a downside to bureaucracy, but there's also an upside, which is that if you take the proper steps that are expected to be taken to make any change internally, right? And then there's also nimawashi, right? Like make sure that you talk to a lot of people who have have a say in whether or not to approve that proposal. A lot of interesting things can actually happen inside Japanese organizations. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, that so that's it. Yeah. So so I guess I was indirectly saying that that's sort of the one way that any of us can try to make an impact internally, and hopefully try to make corporations behave differently. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other piece to just name is that it is about in the U.S. this piece is most of the social sector is funded by foundations and individuals, right? That's who, and most of those foundations come from historic wealth creation from corporations, right? So there is a very close circle. But I think about, this question now around getting corporates to do more and to act in different ways and to give more. I think also the question for me, though, is not just about the money that corporations can give, which, I would love to see the US pass corporate social responsibility, and have more of a strong push around that for sure. But, I don't think it's just about giving. I think it's also about other things like, the corporations who match their employees giving. That's really important. But then there are several corporations who also will add a dollar match to employees volunteering. And so it is part of it is also like, what is the culture and ethos that the corporation is enabling in their community to get their employees connected into their local communities, to be problem solvers in their local communities, and to keep people really community centered versus just employment centered. And I think that is a struggle in our world right now, is that for many of us, your identity is work. Certainly in the US, that's true, right? So I think that that's one of the big opportunities for corporations, is to keep their employees really connected into their communities and to encourage that and have a value set that really pushes for that.
So community-centered versus employment-centered, that's a very interesting kind of paradigm there. I'm going to shift over. I mean, if you'd like to ask any questions, we are running a bit short on time, but please feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to pick up one question or quote or comment from Damien, who I believe is here as well. He says, "I would love to see philanthropists make noise about wanting to support NPOs who have a plan to evolve their fundraising if they have a plan to show a sensible ROI." Damien, do you want to share a bit more of your thoughts on that? And I think you're on mute, just as a warning.
Yeah, I am on mute. Yeah, I've spoken with a lot of NPOs in Japan who still believe that the public don't want to give, that they believe that the government is going to take care of everything, and then I've spoken to a lot of fundraisers who believe that, well, because the public don't want to give, maybe we should target corporates because they have lots of money. But when you're dealing with corporate donors, they have a lot of strings attached with their donation. They want to make sure that you're doing things the way they want. The organization that I'm working for right now, we focus on individual giving. We have 80,000 regular donors each month, plus another maybe 10 or 15,000 donors who give a one-time gift. So we focus a lot on face-to-face fundraising and direct marketing. So for face-to-face fundraising, I think we have something like 90 face-to-face fundraisers around Japan, which compared to our organization in Spain is minuscule. But with direct marketing, we just buy lists of contacts. And so last month we had 2 campaigns. One was targeting our middle donors, and then the other one was just sending letters out to 500,000 people. And we get a very good response. And I think if organizations understood, here's the steps you take to move forward, make a plan around that, and then ask philanthropists for support to help you get that going, because you might not have the resources to do that. If they just have a plan, if they have some kind of case study, something that gives them permission to make this decision, I think it could really help the sector to evolve. And that's what we all want, I think, to see the sector in Japan evolve.
Thanks for sharing that, Damien. Any response from Kenji? Maybe this is more Japan focused, so I can hand over to Kenji.
Sure. Although I think Sudha probably has more to say on that. Yeah, I think that I have heard that too, and I believe things are starting to change, hopefully for the better. So even in things like the idea that nonprofits, they really should not be paying that much money to the staff, right? Try to leverage volunteers as much as possible, keep costs down. And so when you still have that kind of ideology, then it's very difficult to professionalize the industry and to bring more expertise and experienced people of the scale that you see in a place like the U.S. And so I agree with you. I think that it's sort of like I think it's both sides. I think on the NPO side, I think they need to be more aggressive, and that not be afraid of asking for money if they think that they're doing something really good. And then on the part of the potential donors, we need to sort of drop this idea that every time some famous NPO, we find out that that the CEO is getting paid this much money. Hey, that's too much for an NPO. You occasionally hear that, and we have to stop that. So, yeah, I think I hear you. Yeah. So that I'll go ahead. Yeah, Robin. Yeah.
I think in May of this year, or May or June or whenever it was, the government did the handouts of cash, or the distribution to everyone. I was speaking to someone the other day who runs a crowdfunding platform, and they were saying their donations went through the roof. That people, because of the situation, are feeling more inclined to give to good causes, and they're actually seeing a very significant increase in volume. So perhaps this is an entire new opportunity to spur that kind of change that we're discussing today as well. Michelle in the comments box says, if you need money for your project, Rotary clubs in Japan are a great way to access project funds, as the Rotary Foundation has an excess of $1 billion for SDG related projects. So that's a great resource. Thank you for sharing that. Last question, and it's got to be a very brief answer, I'm afraid, but are you seeing, this is a question from Anu, are you seeing a shift in philanthropic giving, funding or innovation in developed nations towards developing nations? If not, is SVP focusing on driving this discussion? So maybe I'll hand over to Sudha for that.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I shared a little bit with Anu in the chat. But it's certainly something that we're thinking about. We do see funds moving from developed nations to developing, to the global south, for sure. There are a lot of challenges to that. I don't have time to get into today. But there are organizations like Thousand Currents is an organization that is specifically focused on that SVP is in conversations with, about how we can also be partners in that. We're certainly thinking about that as we think about our US partnership. Many of them have asked how they can get involved with, say, our India partnership. So this is a big part of the conversation, right? Should the money that we raise and give philanthropically stay in the country, or should it move to the global south? And I think, especially as we take on challenges like climate change, we're going to have to figure out better systems to move that money. But with the recognition that many countries are rightfully skeptical and worried about the influence of outsized philanthropy in their community governance.
Great, thank you.
My very short answer.
Thanks. I think we'll have to do a follow-up event, clearly. But given the time is running short, I would like to give the opportunity to Kenji and Sudha to maybe just share a very short 20 to 30 second final message, if you have one. Any calls to action, anything that you'd like to share for our audience here today. So I will go with Sudha first.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Robin, Social Innovation Japan, and everyone who joined us today. This has been really lovely, and so appreciate the conversation. We have just put up a new website, reimaginegiving.org. It's very much in basic phase. We're going to be developing a global platform over the course of 2021. So please check that out. I'll drop it in the chat. You're also welcome to find me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'd love to stay in touch with anyone who's interested. But reimaginegiving.org, if you sign up there, we can keep you posted, and I'd love to engage further with any of you.
Great. I've just shared the links in the box, so please check them out. And next, I'll hand over to Kenji.
Yeah, thank you, everyone for listening in, and thank you to Social Innovation Japan, for providing this platform. I want to also say that reimagine giving. I think a lot of us in Japan, we feel sometimes kind of isolated from the global philanthropic movements that are happening. But the reason why I love SVP and international work is that it really gives me and SVP Tokyo to be part of this global network. And so please check out Reimagine Giving. I think it's a wonderful initiative, and we hope to keep scaling it. So thank you.
Perfect. And thank you both. Thank you to both of our speakers. Can we give them a big virtual round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you. As for next steps, please feel free to join. We have a Social Innovation Japan Facebook group where lots of people share information on events, on different opportunities to get more involved. I think this discussion was really, it was extremely comprehensive in this very limited time, but it was a very important way to think about what's happening currently in the world of philanthropy, whether we're businesses, whether we're NGOs, whether we're entrepreneurs. So it was great to have this discussion with everyone. And we hope to have another event like this again soon so that we can connect and continue this dialogue to essentially drive that change that we discussed today. Please feel free to share your LinkedIn profiles or whatever in the Zoom chat. Let's all stay connected and have a lovely weekend. Thank you again to our co-hosts, Social Venture Partners. And that's it from us. Thank you very much.